AntiTribe, the Freakin Weekend 104. Today's episode focuses on Sex Offender Lite, the future that doesn't work, and the enemies within. As always, we're brought to you by the banks the pedocracy uses to finance its baby-raping and baby-eating sex trafficking enterprises, JP Morgan Chase Them Kids, and Deutsche Bank. Jeffrey is waiting for Ghislaine's body double to be off so that they can be together at last in Tel Aviv after the Iranian bombing stops. Starring child sex offenders who got off after getting off, Big Dumb America, and various politicos and judges. As always, we're brought to you by the same people who bring us every war ever, along with child sacrifice and ritual abuse, Zionists, Talmudic and Kabbalistic Jews, and David Lee Hamblin's dirty dick. Remember, you can be betrothed by intercourse to a 3-year and 1-day-old girl if only you're a Talmudic Jew. Fuck them kids, Jaime.
Welcome to AntiTribe, the Freakin Weekend, episode 104. This episode is centered on, as we said in the opening, Sex Offender Lite, that is, sex offenders who got lesser included sentences, the future that doesn't work, and enemies within. And as always, we're brought to you by the banks the pedocracy uses to finance their baby-raping and baby-eating sex trafficking enterprises. That would be JP Morgan Chase Them Kids and Deutsche Bank. And so I want to go right into the opening here. I want to talk about the number of recent sexual abuse cases where the offender received inexplicably lenient sentences. And part of that is due to the reality that so many of our judges, so many of our politicians, so many of those who are politically connected or financially well off are able to engage in sexual abuse with virtual impunity. And so we're gonna jump right into that, and I'm going to begin with a Republican out of Missouri, Missouri Senator Mike Moon. And this is one of the enemies within that I want to highlight in this podcast. Missouri Senator Mike Moon, he voted against legislation that would have prohibited child marriage in Missouri, and he argued for a 12-year-old being married to an adult, as long as that 12-year-old's parents consented to the arrangement. And he did so in exchange with fellow legislator Senator Peter Meredith, who was a Democrat who was angry that Mike Moon was opposing Democratic legislation to allow children to transition their gender. And so Pete Meredith brought up that earlier vote that Mike Moon voted against legislation that would have prohibited child marriage. So let's take a look at that clip, shall we?
The parents' right and the kids' right to decide what's best for them, to be raped by an adult. Okay?
Do you know any kids who have been
With
married
marriage.
at age 12?
That was the law.
Do you know
You
any
voted
kids-
not to change it.
Do you know any kids who have been married at age 12?
I don't need to.
I do. And guess what? They're still married.
So let's take a look at that clip yet
The
again.
parents' right and the kids' right to decide what's best for them, to be raped by an adult. Okay?
Do you know any kids who have been
With
married
marriage.
at age 12? Do you
That
know
was
any-
the law.
do you know
You
any
voted
kids-
not to change it.
Do you know any kids who have been married at age 12?
I don't need to.
I do. And guess what? They're still married.
So that's what we're dealing with here. That's the level of what it is that we are confronting as a society. We have a Republican, ostensibly a conservative, who should know better that 12-year-olds aren't on the agenda or aren't on the menu in terms of marriage. He should also know that any parent that would consent to their 12-year-old child being married off is probably a sexual abuser, a sexual predator, or deviant themselves. That's usually where that originates. So we know this from virtually every example where it occurs. When the child becomes an adult and they have agency and they begin to speak for themselves on the matter, we find out that the adults in their family were sexually abusive to them. Take the Kingston cult, for example, a polygamous group in Utah that forces children to marry their half-siblings in order to maintain bloodline purity. So it's incest, it's child sexual abuse, and of course the fathers are giving the children marriage lessons. They're giving their daughters marriage lessons, and I've spoken personally with multiple victims out of the Kingston group who say that the fathers are also molesting the male children, if not delivering their male children to higher-ranking men in the numeral system that every Kingston male has a number that indicates their rank within the hierarchy. And so these men are allegedly taking male children and having homosexual intercourse with them, in addition to the marriage lessons that they give their daughters. And then they force those children to marry their half-siblings or their uncles or whoever within the Kingston group that the leaders dictate that this child should be married to. That's where child marriage originates. And any parent who wants to marry off their 12-year-old is ultimately a pervert. They're a sexual deviant. They're a child sexual abuser. They're a predator. And they should be scrutinized for even having the idea. That's the reality of this issue. And so Senator Mike Moon, Republican of Missouri, voted against legislation that would have prohibited child marriage, that would have prohibited 12-year-olds from being married off to adults with their parents' permission. But on the other hand, he opposed legislation that would have allowed a child with gender dysphoria to transition. And so let's take a look at this situation. We have two creeps here. One is a guy who wants mentally ill children to be able to surgically mutilate themselves. That's Pete Meredith, the Democrat. And the other is a guy who thinks that sexually abusive parents should be able to marry off their 12-year-olds to adults. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican, and proving that the uniparty is basically two shitty tastes that taste shitty together. Like, call me crazy, but I do think that this is why Congress has an approval rating of 15% according to Gallup. Because this is something that keeps coming up in the congressional record as well in terms of the various parties' positions. Even with this little exchange between Senators Meredith and Moon, the Missouri General Assembly has an approval rating of around 48%. So over in Washington State, like, we have Senator Jamie Peterson, who argued on Fox News that parents didn't have a right to notification if their mentally ill 13-year-old child with gender dysphoria wanted to undergo or pursue surgical mutilation or hormone therapy. Maybe they want to carve up their genitalia, so on and so forth. Parents aren't entitled to be notified. If they're old enough to get pregnant, Jamie Peterson says, they're old enough to make their own health care decisions without parental authorization or input. Because, 13-year-olds are doing such a good job of raising children. And if you think I'm making this up, I want to show you, like, this clip. I want to show you what's going on in Washington State with Senator Jamie Peterson. I want to show you this clip real quickly.
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions. about what happens with their bodies, okay? And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
So we had a little malfunction there in terms of that clip, so I'm going to play it again real quickly. So I want you to take a look at Jamie Peterson and what he has to say on this issue. So let's roll that clip again, shall we?
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions about what happens with their bodies, okay?
Exactly. If they're old enough to get pregnant, these young women, who are children according to the law for good reason because they're 13, they're old enough to make decisions about their health care. And for Peterson, who's a gay man who's married to another gay man, this is an issue. This is the hill he wants to die on. And he actually said this on a live televised interview on Fox News. Like, he actually said it. So let's review it again. I want you to understand you're not having a stroke when you hear this or watch it.
And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
Parents don't have a right to change their 13-year-old's decisions as it pertains to health care. They don't have a right to be notified. They don't have a right to any input in the decision at all.
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions about what happens with their bodies, okay? And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
Of course not. Of course not. You know, this is who we are. This is what we vote for in various states and districts across this country. So Jamie Peterson is a gay man who is married to a high school special education teacher. He met at Central Lutheran Church because that's how far we've gone. You know, you meet your gay husband at gay church, and he teaches disabled kids at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. You know, I wonder if Jamie Peterson would be happy if his kids, he's got 4 of them. He's got triplets and he's got an older son. I wonder if he'd be happy if his kids decided to go to conversion therapy with a conservative psychiatrist in order to overcome their same-sex attraction. I wonder if he'd be okay with the children bypassing his input or supervision or consent with respect to that. You know, I wonder. I wonder if that would be the case. Like, I absolutely wonder if that's going to be the case. Like, just one more time for everybody to understand what Jamie Peterson felt bold enough to say on a publicly televised interview.
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions about what happens with their bodies, okay? And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
No shit. That's the level. That's a publicly elected official out of Washington State. His constituents presumably don't have a problem with this. They don't have a problem with their 13-year-old child bypassing them entirely when it comes to health decisions that they make. Because, you know, every 13-year-old you know is mature enough to make that decision. They're old enough to get pregnant, as Jamie Peterson notes. And if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make decisions as it pertains to their own health care. So, you know, Peterson's husband, Eric, he's on the board at Bailey Boucher House, which is a nonprofit serving gay men, because gay men need a place to go to get HIV and AIDS care, because they account for 53% of all new HIV infections each year, despite being only under 5% of the population. That's exactly who you want grooming your kids without your consent, behind your back, without your input. That's who you want, parents, if you're in District 43. I believe that's the 43rd district in Washington State that's the district that elected this man, Jamie Peterson, to be their state senator. I mean, it's great. Everything about this is great. His husband is teaching kids in a special education classroom with extreme disabilities. Presumably, those children are capable of making their own health care decisions without their parents' input. This was the subject of a recent, Supreme Court decision last week. Okay? The Supreme Court struck down California's efforts to cut parents out of the loop when their kids claim to be transgender. So let's take a look at some of the things that went on with that a little bit later in this podcast. But I want to play you another clip of Jamie Peterson. I want to play you another clip of this asshole, out of Washington State, who's arguing for parents to be cut out of the loop when it comes to their 13-year-old children, their 13-year-old daughters. So let's take a look at what Peterson has to say on the matter a second time, shall we?
Kids over 13 have the complete right to make their own decisions about their mental health care. Parents don't have a right to have notice. They don't have a right to have consent about that.
Yeah. Why would they have a right to have consent about it? Why would they have a right to have any consent whatsoever about that? Let's take a look at it again.
Kids over 13 have the complete right to make their own decisions about their mental health care. Parents don't have a right to have notice. They don't have a right to have consent about that. Kids over 13 have the complete right to make their own decisions about their mental health care. Parents don't have a right to have notice. They don't have a right to have consent about that. Kids.
Yeah. I mean, every time I watch that, I think I'm having an aneurysm. But I'm not. I'm abso-fucking-lutely not having an aneurysm or a stroke. I'm not hallucinating. This is a publicly elected official who's saying this shit.
Anxious for the last few
So let's take a look at what he has to say in the second clip, shall we?
That is ambiguous in the initiative. Some language that potentially calls into question a lot of other statutes that we have passed protecting the agency and autonomy of young people, particularly our teenagers as they go through middle school and high school, to make their own health care decisions and to make other decisions about themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let's take a look at that whole situation again real quickly.
Kids over 13 have the complete right to make their own decisions about their mental health care. Parents don't have a right to have notice. They don't have a right to have consent about that.
Yeah, I mean, why not?
I've been anxious for the last few months about some language that is ambiguous in the initiative, some language that potentially calls into question a lot of other statutes that we have passed protecting the agency and autonomy of young people, particularly our teenagers as they go through middle school and high school, to make their own health care decisions and to make other decisions about themselves.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's talk about the autonomy of teenagers to make their own healthcare decisions, because anybody who's ever known a teenager knows that teenagers just make great choices. Absolutely make fabulous decisions when it comes to their healthcare in their lives, especially when those decisions are divorced from what their parents have to say. I mean, listen to it again.
I've been anxious for the last few months about some language that is ambiguous in the initiative, some language that potentially calls into question a lot of other statutes that we have passed protecting the agency and autonomy of young people, particularly our teenagers as they go through middle school and high school, to make their own health care decisions and to make other decisions about themselves.
Yeah. I mean, he's been very concerned about that because he's very concerned about your kids, not his own 4 kids, your kids. He's very concerned about your kids and their autonomy. And isn't it funny how that works? All these radical leftists who are concerned about your kids, and all these creepy Republicans who are concerned about parents who want to marry their 12-year-olds off to adults, and the right of parents to do that, without any second thought as to whether or not maybe those parents who would do something like that are in fact sexual abusers themselves. Because if you're okay with, I don't know, your 12-year-old daughter being married off, it might be a pretty damn big red flag that you yourself are a pervert who's okay with a 12-year-old having sex with an adult, because that's what marriage is. There's a sexual component to it. So when you're okay with with marrying off your 12-year-old daughter to an adult male, you're saying, I'm okay with that adult male having sex with my kid. Now, I mean, that's what Mike Boone is saying in Missouri when he votes against a law that would ban child marriage. And he's Republican. He's conservative. He's family values. Now, a lot of this, like cutting parents out of the loop in terms of like what Jamie Peterson out of Washington State wants to do with regards to children and 13-year-olds making their own health care decisions. Parents shouldn't be notified. Parents should have power of authorization. Parents shouldn't have any input whatsoever, because the 13-year-old is old enough to get pregnant. So screw it. You know, let's take a look at Jamie Peterson again. Let's take a look at the earlier clip that I played.
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions about what happens with their bodies, okay? And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
Exactly. So let's take a look at what the state of California faced here recently. I want to switch over real quickly. The first thing you're going to see right in the middle of the page, it's overlaid with test scores, because those are both relevant things here. I want to give you a little insight into a recent Supreme Court decision regarding California's efforts to cut parents out of the process when their kids were being socially transitioned by groomers at school. This is a case, it's Mirabelli versus Bonta, and the Supreme Court recently ruled on this last week. So the Supreme Court struck down California's efforts to keep parents out of the loop when their kids claimed to be transgender and they were being socially transitioned at school. So the teachers could socially transition the kids, use the preferred pronouns, encourage their gender dysphoria, which is a mental illness, according to the DSM. Never once informed the parents that their kid was manifesting mental illness. So the Supreme Court said, oh no, the parents are the primary protectors of their children's best interest, And parents have primary authority with respect to the upbringing and education of their children, which includes the right not to be shut out of participation in decisions regarding their children's mental health. So I want to give you a little insight to the background of this and why this was such a big deal in California. So the little excerpt that you see in the middle of your screen right now, two of the parent plaintiffs, John and Jane Poe, have religious objections in gender transitioning, but were not told by their daughter's school when she began to present as a boy and use a male name and male pronouns during her 7th grade year. In parent-teacher meetings, no one told the Poes about their daughters transitioning or referring to her using the male name and pronouns that were used at school. At the beginning of their daughter's 8th grade year, she attempted suicide and was hospitalized. Only then did her parents learn from a doctor that she had gender dysphoria and had been presenting as a boy at school. Just months after being discharged, the Poe's daughter was rehospitalized and held there involuntarily because she was at risk of self-harm. At a new school in 9th grade, she once again began identifying as a boy. Contrary to the Poe's instructions, teachers and school officials continued to use a male name and pronouns for their daughter, citing their obligations under California state law. The Poes have placed their daughter in therapy and obtained psychiatric care for her. Gender dysphoria is a mental illness. Plain and simple. It always has been, always will be. There's no such thing as a transgender person. There is a mentally ill person who's biologically one sex who thinks that they're another sex. Gender is a useless social construct that has no empirical validity whatsoever. It's the same thing with sexual orientation. It's a social construct. It's a concept invented out of thin air by social scientists. Now, I want to say something about the social sciences. Maybe you've heard me say it before. Social sciences are neither scientific nor social. They are the antithesis of both. There's only one empirical basis here, and that is the empirical basis for sex, biological sex. That is, men have an XY chromosome, or XY chromosomes, and women have 2 X chromosomes. That's it. Males and females are differentiated at the chromosomal level. That's the only empirical basis you have for sex differentiation or sexual identity. Now, there are people who are mentally ill for whatever reason who believe that they were born in the wrong body. It's called gender dysphoria. It's in the DSM. It's a recognized mental disorder. And ultimately, what happens when parents are bypassed by educators who don't want to stay in their lane is this mentally ill kid, John and Jane Poe's daughter, tried to kill himself in 8th grade. And her parents had no idea that she was mentally ill, that she had gender dysphoria. The parents find out that the school has been affirming the mental illness, telling her daughter that her delusions are real, and this leads to the suicide attempt. When the parents became aware that their child has gender dysphoria, they instruct the school to stop reinforcing a mental illness. The school disregards their instructions. So teachers are not mental health professionals. Their job is to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. So let's check on how California's doing in that area. How are they doing when it comes to teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic? So let's pull that back up real quickly, shall we? Let's pull that up. Let's do test scores. And I want you to pay attention to your screen because here are the test scores in California. Just 37% of California students in all grades meet or exceed standards in math. Under half, 48%, or 48.82%, meet or exceed standards for English language arts. But hey, if your kid can't read, write, or do basic math, and they say that they're a girl when they're a biological male or vice versa, they know best. They know best. Like, absolutely. 100% validity here. Here's a kid who can't read or write or do basic math, but they know, even though they're a biological male, that they're a girl, or even though they're a biological female, that they're a boy. They know best. You shouldn't, as a parent, be notified. In fact, these untrained mental health professionals, self-appointed mental health professionals, teachers, should guide them along their way and use the correct pronouns, thereby reinforcing the mental illness is real rather than delusional. Like, that's the level that we're at here. So I'm not buying that Republicans are any better than Democrats when it comes to protecting children or upholding the right of children not to be abused by adults, because they aren't. They aren't. Mike Moon, as I said earlier, he wants 12-year-olds to be married off with parental consent. He doesn't seem to get that the type of parent who would consent to their 12-year-old being married off is probably a pedophile and a child abuser. You don't understand that at all. He's all about parental rights. That is, you can marry your 12-year-old off to another guy, and they can get fucked by a grown man, because they can be married with your consent as a parent, and you as a parent probably were sexually abusing them too. God knows what you got paid or what value exchange took place in terms of you swapping out your kid to this person, what they gave you in exchange for that, but they did. And Mike Moon, he believes that 12-year-olds should be married off with their parents' consent. If you think I'm being too harsh or just overly critical, I want you to consider the following example. I want you to consider the case of a legislator in North Dakota named Ray Holmberg. So I want you to consider that. I want you to consider that Ray Holmberg took 14 trips. 14 trips to Prague, Czech Republic. He took 14 trips to Prague in the Czech Republic, and he did so in order to have sex with boys.
In a case report from the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation, former North Dakota lawmaker Ray Holmberg was found to have sent emails discussing his sexual abuse of minors with other prominent North Dakota figures. The North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation sent us a case report detailing its findings, which it says came from Nicholas DeRosier's Samsung. DeRosier is from Grand Forks and was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison when he pleaded guilty to receiving and possessing child sexual abuse material. The report says the emails show Holmberg had been arranging to meet with minors for sexual encounters spanning as far back as 2008. The report mentions a number of businessmen with North Dakota ties to have been aware of and possibly participated in the abuse with Holmberg. The report indicates the ages of the victims mentioned in the email conversations could have ranged from 13 to 16 years old. The men listed as accomplices to Holmberg in his sexual abuse of minors had ties to North Dakota higher education. In response, the North Dakota University system sent out a response saying in part, "We feel despair for the victims and their families and shock that individuals connected to the State Board of Higher Education or North Dakota University system may have had knowledge of Holmberg's conduct."
Yeah, there we go. There we go. So here's a state senator, 40-year plus veteran of the North Dakota legislature, Ray Holmberg, who was making arrangements to have sex with kids as far back as 2008, based on the evidence found in this man named DeRosier's phone. And the people connected to him were part of the North Dakota University higher education system. They knew what he was doing. They were potentially participating in those same sorts of activities. And as the headline up here says, he called a man named Shinahan after the police searched his property and his devices. This is significant because this gentleman here, Shinahan, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I don't even give a shit. This guy does not deserve to have his name pronounced correctly. He was the Attorney General of North Dakota at that time. And he destroyed his communications. He lied to investigators. And what happened to Ray Holmberg, who took 14 trips? 14 trips to Prague over a 10-year period, 2011 to 2021. He took 14 trips to Prague in the Czech Republic to have sex with boys at a child brothel. He was also communicating with a 16-year-old in Canada, and he was posing as another teenager to get that 16-year-old to send him child porn. That is, photographs of himself in like a sexually explicit sense. And guess how much time he got? 10 years. He got 10 years. He was eligible for 30 years in a sentence, but the judge gave him 10 years out of a possible 30. So he didn't even get a year for each time he went to Prague to rape kids. He got 10 years. And he was in the North Dakota State Legislature for 45 years. And of course, based on the text messages and everything else, there were multiple other individuals who knew what Ray Holmberg was up to. Here's a quote from his online communications about those trips. Quote, "No one is ever too young. Ellipses, remember Prague." It wasn't like he was being discreet about this. It wasn't like he was hiding what he was doing. He was communicating with multiple other people. So he went to a child brothel, and he raped young boys at that brothel. He also went to a park in Prague, in front of the main train station in Prague, to rape more boys. And, of course, based on the news coverage, the prices started at $60. Sex was extra. Because, of course it is. And some of these boys were as young as, 13. And they were child sex slaves in Prague. So here comes Ray Holmberg, 45-year veteran of the North Dakota State Legislature. He takes 14 trips to Prague that we know of to rape young boys in a brothel and in a public park. And he communicates with other people about what he's doing in the North Dakota higher education system. He communicates with this gentleman named DeRosier, whose text messages on his phone were the basis of the criminal investigation. DeRosier was originally investigated for construction fraud by law enforcement. So the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation uncovered these text messages, and it wasn't just Holmberg. It was other prominent North Dakotans implicated in Holmberg's case, according to the records from Nicholas Morgan DeRosier's cell phone, which had 72 text messages between DeRosier and Holmberg. Now, DeRosier got 40 years in prison for receiving and distributing child pornography. Think about that. Nicholas DeRosier got 4 times the sentence as Ray Holmberg, who traveled abroad 14 times to rape boys. That's not in dispute. He discussed the pricing. He discussed what he did in Prague and where he went to do it. And he got 10 years for 14 trips abroad over a 10-year period to rape kids. And DeRosier wasn't any better. I mean, he was producing child porn with his prepubescent family members. So there was evidence that he sexually assaulted multiple minors. And, of course, there's also evidence that Ray Holmberg sexually assaulted multiple minors, but he only got 10 years. DeRosier got 40. Ask yourself why that is. I mean, perhaps the reason Holmberg was able to evade culpability as long as he did is that he was close with the North Dakota Attorney General, as we said earlier. That would be Wayne Steinham. Steinham died in office, and his executive assistant, a woman named Liz Brocker, directed the IT department to delete his email account. I don't wonder why she would do that. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that Steinham misled investigators and deleted voicemails from Ray Holmberg the day Holmberg was subject to the execution of a search warrant by law enforcement. I want you to understand something. Republicans and Democrats agree on very little beyond covering up their exposure to child rape and adult rape and sexual harassment, which is why they recently voted 357 to 65 to kill the release of Nancy Mace's resolution to make public all reports on allegations of lawmakers and aides in Congress who engaged in sexual assault or harassment. Like, Congress has an office dedicated to covering up sexual abuse settlements. It's called the Office of Compliance. And they were paid, or they've paid out $17 million of your money to settle 268 cases through the Office of Compliance. And that doesn't count the settlements paid out of office budgets by members. That's your money being used to cover up sexual abuse and harassment by elected officials. These are your enemies within. These are the people who argue that 12-year-olds should be married off with their pervert parents' permission. Because Republicans support parental rights over their children and their upbringing in the same way that Democrats support an educator's right to groom that kid on the issue of sexual attraction and gender identity. In the meantime, kids are getting beaten down and ripped to pieces by this nonsense. So, speaking of kids getting beaten down and torn to pieces and abused, let's move on. Let's talk about a guy named Colton Johansson. Let's talk about this guy, because he's an Ogden police officer. And I want to highlight the level at which this guy operated. I want to highlight that real quickly.
What does the case of elementary school teacher Mark Burnt tell us about the scale of the problem in California?
Okay. Mark Burnt, to set the stage, was a third grade teacher at Miramonte Elementary School. He was hired at the Los Angeles Unified School District. There was complaints about Mr. Burnt's conduct throughout his tenure through 2012 when he was arrested. He was exposing his genitals in class. Teachers reported it.
So, yeah, that's from last week's episode. It's a guy in California named Mark Burnt. But in my upper left-hand corner is an Ogden High School school resource officer and Ogden Police Department veteran named Colton Johansson. Now, Mr. Johansson looks like your typical cop, but he engaged in a sexual act with an infant in 1994, and the reason we know that is because he admitted to it. He was disclosing it during a polygraph examination for a lateral law enforcement position to school resource officer. He was failing that polygraph examination, so the examiner stopped the examination and asked him why he was not being truthful. And so Johansson disclosed that he had molested an infant in 1994 and that he had child sexual abuse material in his garage. He said that He was going through the child sexual abuse material to find adult sexual abuse material so that he could pleasure himself sexually. Of course, in the context against the backdrop of the fact that he molested an infant 30 years ago, that kind of rings hollow. It just seems like bullshit because it is bullshit. So he pleaded guilty to lesser charges. He was originally charged with 10 counts of sexual exploitation of a minor, tampering with evidence, and official misconduct. Because here's the thing about possessing child porn. There's an exemption in the statute for law enforcement officers who are performing their duties in investigating a child sexual abuse material case, like sexual exploitation of a minor. They're exempted. They can possess that as evidence. They can examine it to make their case. Colton Johansson was not an SVU officer. He's not an SVU detective. He was a school resource officer at Ogden High School, which puts him in proximity to children that he can abuse. He's in a position of authority over those children. And he's not conducting any investigative work in a child sexual abuse material case whatsoever. He's just storing this material in his garage and, by his own admission, going through it to find material for his own sexual gratification. Now, he says that the material he used for his sexual gratification involved adults rather than children. But he admitted to abusing an infant. He admitted to doing that, I don't know, in 1994, 32 years ago. And yet, even though it's illegal for him to possess child porn outside of an investigation, let's talk about the implication for child porn cases. That is, investigations against people who possess, produce, or distribute child pornography. Because by taking that evidence home and storing it in his private residence in his garage, that breaks the chain of custody. It potentially raises questions about the admissibility of evidence. So, guess what Colton Johansson's sentence was? What he received in actual prison time? He didn't receive any prison time. He got 30 days in county jail. He admitted to the crimes against him, to the polygraph examiner. All the elements of the crime were established by his admission. He admitted to sexually abusing an infant 32 years ago in 1994. He admitted to possessing child pornography for something other than investigative purposes. He admitted to going through child pornography in an explanation that should strain the credulity of the credulous. He said that he went through that material solely for the purposes of finding adult pornography with adults in it, so that he could sexually pleasure himself. But he's the type of dude who's sexually attracted enough to an infant to molest them in 1994. That's what he admitted to. I guarantee you there's a whole lot he didn't admit to. And the police and the prosecution should have been looking into his time as a school resource officer at Ogden High School. They should have been looking in a lot of other places to determine the full extent of what his crimes were, but they did not. They said it was a complicated case, and that maybe he would have gotten a not guilty verdict. But based on his own admission, it's doubtful that any jury would have voted to acquit him of the charges against him. But we'll never know, because the case never actually reached the jury. And so he got 30 days in county jail, 4 years of probation, and 60 days of home confinement. He gets credit for 2 days of time served. So he'll actually only do 28 days in county jail, 60 days of home confinement, and he'll do 4 years of probation. Like, it's absolutely against the law for him to possess child porn at his private residence. It's absolutely against the law for him to view child porn outside of investigating a crime. It's totally against the law for him to sexually abuse an infant. And he admitted to all of these crimes, and he got 30 days in county jail. 28, given that he's got 2 days of credit for time served. So his victim from 32 years ago in 1994 appeared in court to say that he forgave Johansson. But the reality of it is if this had not come to light through that polygraph examination, the victim would have never known what Johansson did. And what the hell relevance does that have to do with anything? Like, Colton Johansson molested a child. It doesn't matter that the child forgave him 31 years or 32 years later. Colton Johansson possessed and viewed child porn outside of his capacity as a law enforcement officer for purposes other than investigating a crime. That's illegal. There's no exception to the law for that. He says he stored it at his house because his employer, Ogden Police Department, would not store such material within its own precincts in an evidence locker. If that sounds like bullshit, it's because it is. And despite all of this, Judge Catherine Conklin said she doesn't believe that Colton Johansson is a danger to the community in any respect whatsoever, because he was being totally honest when he only disclosed abusing one child. Like, Colton Johansson was sentenced to 30 days of jail time, 60 days of home confinement, and 4 years of probation for possessing hundreds of child porn images and for molesting an infant. He's not a danger to the community in any respect, according to Judge Conklin. So, I want to wrap this up by saying we live in a future that doesn't work. We live in a future where out of 1,000 reports or 1,000 cases of sexual assault, about 310 are going to be reported. About 50 are going to lead to an arrest. 28 are going to lead to a conviction. And around 25 are going to lead to incarceration. And a lot of the sentences that are levied on these individuals, like Colton Johansson, former school resource officer at Ogden High School, those sentences are going to be laughably low. I have hundreds of these cases in my bookmarks and in folders. Okay? The reality of it is the number of people who get suspended sentences who don't do any time whatsoever for the crimes that they commit against children is infinite. So in the event that they're one of the 28 out of 1,000 people who are convicted of sexual assault, they're going to receive a sentence that is laughably low. They're going to be like Colton Johansson. They're going to get 30 days of home confinement or 30 days in the county jail with 2 days of credit for time served. Or better yet, like Jeffrey Epstein. He's going to be charged for crimes he didn't actually commit because teenage girls can't consent. They can't be prostitutes. That's what he got. That's what he got convicted of down in Florida. He got convicted of soliciting prostitution. Well, those girls didn't have the capacity of consent, so they weren't prostitutes. He raped those children. Like, he raped those children, and what we've seen and what's been released to the Epstein files is horrific. And you're part of a future that doesn't work. And here's the reality. It's been over a month since those files were released. We all know what's in them, even though there are future files to be released. And what's in those files is bad enough to warrant you being out in the street breaking shit. And yet, barely anything has happened. There's barely any public outrage. There certainly isn't any political consequence to the people who obstructed the release of this and the people who are in those files as being abusers. For those of us who figured out how to uncover the video footage and the pictures by converting the PDFs into like PNG or JPEG files or movie files, it's even worse. Like, even though the pictures and the video are redacted to a degree, it's very clear what's going on. They are raping kids. And they're not just obscuring the victim's identity, they're obscuring the perpetrator's identity, and they have no legal basis to do that. None. The federal law that compelled the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, and the FBI to release these files specifically said only the victim's identifying information was to be redacted. Well, that didn't happen because a lot of victims' information was unredacted. But the perpetrators, their information was redacted. Like, at the end of the day, you are part of a future that doesn't work. You're part of a situation where, as I said in last week's episode, in terms of like California teaching freak, these teachers are doing things like serving kids semen-laced cookies. Let's pull that clip up since I mistakenly included it in one of the scenes, right? Let's pull that clip up and let's go back to that scene real quickly. Let's go back to the Colton Johansson scene. So I want to pull that photo down underneath my video capture, and I want to transition. So,
what does the case of elementary school teacher Mark Burnt tell us about the scale of the problem in California?
Okay. Mark Burnt, to set the stage, was a third grade teacher at Miramonte Elementary School. He was hired at the Los Angeles Unified School District. There was complaints about Mr. Burnt's conduct throughout his tenure through 2012 when he was arrested. He was exposing his genitals in class. Teachers reported it. He was wearing wildly inappropriate clothes, tight shorts with his genitals showing, wearing Mickey Mouse ears, photographing children, openly taking children in his classroom after class alone in violation of rules, just year after year after year after year, principal after principal after principal.
So how was he finally stopped?
So what happened was there was a young woman in a CVS drugstore in Redondo Beach, California, where he lived, who was developing analog film. As it came across out of the machine, she noticed these disturbing pictures of children with tape over their mouths, with substances dripping down their chin, eating cookies, cockroaches on them. And believe it or not, in California and other states, photographic techs are mandatory reporters. She did her job. She called. And the Redondo Beach police finally called LAPD, and they looked into it. And Mr. Burnt, it turned out, had been feeding semen-laced Oreo cookies to his children for years. Hundreds of victims. We have current cases against LAUSD, and there's 1,200 other school districts. And the reality is, no one knows how many teachers have abused. Nobody knows how many teachers have been credibly accused. Nobody knows how many teachers have been in the state suspended from teaching or had their licenses suspended. It's completely opaque, and it shouldn't be. The one thing we should be doing is to protect children from this. No one is talking about what effectively is the elephant in the room, which is, if you believe the federal government, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children that are affected by this in this country in public schools.
So here you go. Here you go. Not only does California want to cut parents out in terms of socially transitioning their children, that is, groomer teachers who can barely get half of the kids to be proficient in math and can only get a third of the kids or so, a little over a third of the kids, to be proficient in reading and writing. California wants those teachers to be the arbiters of the mental health of children who have gender dysphoria, and they want them to be able to not disclose to parents that their kid is at school as a boy pretending to be a girl, or as a girl who thinks she's a boy. That's the mental illness of gender dysphoria. California wants to cut parents out of that altogether, and parents had to go to the Supreme Court to get that to stop, like as we outlined earlier in this podcast. But not only does California want to do that, California also wants to not disclose to parents that a teacher is serving their children semen-laced cookies and sexually abusing their children, exposing his genitals in class to them. This is a third-grade teacher, by the way. This is the level in California. So if you're a parent who's sending your kid to like public school in California, good luck. Good luck. This is the kind of shit that's going on in California classrooms. This is the future that doesn't work. They're taking your tax dollars, and California has paid out billions in sexual abuse settlements. Of course, California isn't paying it out. Their taxpayers are paying it out. They're paying it out because public officials, that is, elected and appointed bureaucrats and publicly employed officials like teachers, are sexually abusing children and not disclosing it to parents. They're socially transitioning children who are mentally ill, who think that they're in the wrong body for their sex. They're cutting parents out of that. And until the parents went to the Supreme Court recently, and the Supreme Court ruled last week that parents have a right to be in the loop when it comes to their child's mental illness, which is manifesting at school, and the teachers shouldn't be in the position of bypassing the parents or concealing from the parents that their own child is mentally ill. That's the level. This is the future that doesn't work. This is a future that none of us voted for in the past, or that we're voting for in the present, or that we support, and yet it continues to happen over and over and over again. And those of us who highlight it, who expose it, who report on it, we're ridiculed as being conspiracy theorists and everything, but this shit is real. This is actually going on. Well, let's take a look at that California Supreme Court decision. Let's take a look at the facts of that decision. John and Jane Poe and what they went through with their daughter. Let's take a look at that real quick. So what you see on your screen is an excerpt from that decision. And let's read that for you. Okay? Two of the parent plaintiffs, John and Jane Poe, have religious objections to gender transitioning, but were not told by their daughter's school when she began to present as a boy and use a male name and male pronouns during her 7th grade year. In parent-teacher meetings, no one ever told the Poes about their daughter's transitioning or referred to her using the male name or pronouns that were used at school. They referred to her as a female in the parent-teacher conferences. They referred to her by her birth name, her real name. And at the beginning of their daughter's 8th grade year, she attempted suicide and was hospitalized. Only then did her parents learn from a doctor that she had gender dysphoria and had been presenting as a boy at school. Just months after being discharged, the Poe's daughter was re-hospitalized and held there involuntarily because she was at risk for self-harm. At a new school in 9th grade, she once again began identifying as a boy. Contrary to the Poe's instructions, teachers and school officials continue to use a male name and pronouns for their daughter, citing their obligations under California state law. The Poes have placed their daughter in therapy and obtained psychiatric care for her. It took a literal Supreme Court case for the Poes to have any relief. They had to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. They had to go there to get California's educators to stop catering to their child's mental illness. And even so, now they're just being informed of what the teachers are doing. They're socially transitioning their daughter, who's mentally ill, who's already had one prior suicide attempt, who had a second involuntary hospitalization. Welcome to the new normal, folks. Welcome to the fact that Congress is using your tax dollars to pay out sexual harassment and sexual abuse settlements by members and employees, congressional aides. Over 250 such instances. $17 million of your money. And that's just what we know about. We don't know about the settlements that were paid out of congressional representatives and senators' budgets. And they're so damn bold about this that they're just out in the open saying, flat out, hey, parents should be able to marry off their 12-year-old. That's Mike Moon out of Missouri, which we covered earlier in this episode. Let's talk about Jamie Peterson in Washington. If a 13-year-old is old enough to get pregnant, then their parents shouldn't have any authorization, any power of authorization, any power of input, any notice whatsoever when it comes to that 13-year-old making a health decision, whether it's gender transition or abortion or anything else. According to Jamie Peterson, the kids should be able to bypass their parents entirely. Of course, the parents are still responsible for feeding, clothing, and sheltering the child. But, the kid has rights. Rights that supersede the parents because, 13-year-olds, they make such great decisions. They make fabulous decisions, which is why they get pregnant at 13. Seriously. This is the level in our current reality, and I fail to understand why people aren't out in the streets demonstrating against it. I fail to understand why people aren't letting their elected officials and their appointed bureaucrats have it. I fail to understand what the fuck is going on in this country. And there are people who are going to watch this episode and have a problem with the language I used or whatever at varying points throughout. I don't give a shit. There's more of a moral obscenity in the fact that Colton Johansson, who admitted to molesting an infant in 1994 and having child porn in his garage, got 30 days. 30 days of jail time. He was eligible for between 1 and 15 years, but Judge Catherine Conklin said that he wasn't a threat to the community. And she gave him 30 days. He got 2 days of credit for time served, so it's actually 28 days. He'll do 60 days of home confinement. He'll do 4 years of probation. That's what we're up against. And even when our elected officials try to do something about this, like Nancy Mason, her resolution to make public all of those sexual harassment, sexual abuse settlements paid by the Office of Compliance, she's voted down. The final tally was like 357 to 65. She's voted down. And the basis for that vote against releasing those settlement details was that Congress wanted to protect the victims. They wanted to protect the victims. They didn't want to protect congressmen like this gentleman out of Texas. His name slips my mind at the moment. But he had an affair, and the woman set herself on fire. Okay? He's since announced his resignation from Congress, but he was fighting it, and he was being upheld by the rest of his congressional colleagues. That's the level of what we're dealing with here. That is a level of satanic evil I can't even begin to quantify. And Nancy Mace and others like Thomas Massey, who have tried to advance transparency on sexual abuse by congressmen and congressional employees, and Jeffrey Epstein, they've been stonewalled at every turn by an establishment that wants to conceal the full extent of sexual misconduct, child sexual abuse. At the end of the day, they believe that it's better for everybody involved to conceal the extent of what Jeffrey Epstein was up to conceal what the political donor class in this country, the shareholder class as I call them, were up to. In the meantime, your elected officials are using your tax dollars to settle their sexual abuse cases and their sexual harassment cases and the sexual abuse cases of teachers and educators who rape kids, who serve kids semen-laced cookies, as we just demonstrated, as we just saw. Something like 16% of kids who go to public school are going to be sexually abused over the course of their matriculation through public education. 16%, that's almost 1 in 6. A little over 1 in 6, actually. And those kids are going to be sexually abused by teachers. And, of course, that's just direct sexual abuse. That doesn't count the number of times that a teacher tells a kid that they're a boy when they're actually a biological girl. That doesn't count as sexual abuse. It should, but it doesn't. Like, I don't want to hear that education is a respectable occupation anymore. It isn't. Like, when you look at the results, when you look at the fact that under half of California students are proficient in math, 48.82%, and a little over a third are proficient in English language arts, that is, reading and writing, in critical analysis, you ask yourself, what are we getting for what we pay? The billions and billions of dollars that we pay in our tax dollars towards public education. What the hell are we getting? What we're getting are educators who have appointed themselves as mental health professionals who are qualified to guide our children through their sexual identity issues and their sexual attraction issues, all the while keeping us as parents out of the loop. They've taken our place. That's the reality. That's the future that doesn't work. In the meantime, we get to watch people like Colton Johansson, who's a cop, a school resource officer at a local high school in Ogden, Utah. He gets 30 days for molesting an infant in 1994 and for having hundreds of child sexual abuse images stored in his garage, potentially endangering God knows how many prosecutions of child abusers and people who possess, distributed, and produce child sexual abuse material, because that evidence is outside of the chain of custody, arguably, if it's stored in his garage and he's going through it for his own personal gratification so that he can have spank bank material. He's not a danger to the community. The hell he isn't. How many cases has he endangered? How many defense attorneys are going to go to court and say, Your Honor, I want to know if that evidence pertained to my client in my client's prosecution? How many convictions are potentially going to be overturned as a result of this? I mean, it's hundreds of images. That's just what law enforcement disclosed to us. Do you trust law enforcement? Do you trust them to tell you the truth about the extent of how they dropped the ball? The fact that Colton Johansson was able to transport this material out of the possession of the police precinct and into his personal, private residence. Like, in the meantime, you've got elected officials who are arguing out in the open for 12-year-olds to be married off by their pervert parents. Like, that's what they want to remain legal. You got Democrats in Washington State who are arguing that 13-year-olds who are old enough to get pregnant are, in fact, old enough to make their own health care decision. Let's take a look at that decision again. Let's take a look at that footage again, because that is just absolutely, that's insane to me. But let's go here again.
Young women have, if they're old enough to get pregnant, they're old enough to make their own decisions about what happens with their bodies, okay? And parents do not have the right to change that or make a different decision or be notified in advance.
I mean, really. Like I watch these clips in show prep time and time again, and was just absolutely flabbergasted that an elected official would feel comfortable saying this bullshit out loud. I was absolutely stunned. I was absolutely stunned when Mike Moon said what he said in a back and forth with a Democrat who wants to transition children. Again, like, Democrats are obsessed with transitioning children. Guys like Mike Moon are obsessed with parents having the right to marry their children off to adults who then have sex with their 12-year-olds. Like, this is the level of governance we have in this country. You can't make this shit up. Like, you can't fathom how this is a reality. You can't fathom how you live in such a society where your elected officials are so unafraid of you, and your publicly employed personnel, such as teachers and educators and administrators, bureaucrats, are so unafraid of you and so unintimidated by you and so unafraid of the potential consequences that they'll just come out and say, like, hey, we should be able to socially transition your mentally ill child who has gender dysphoria. We should be able to use their pronouns and their preferred name, not their birth name, not their legal name that you gave them, not the correct pronouns that conform to their biological sex. We should be able to placate them and to reaffirm their mental illness as reality and to call their delusions reality without you knowing about it. And you as a parent, you can't go to the local courts for relief because they're populated by people like us. They're populated by people who believe that we as educators, who can barely do our jobs when it comes to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and getting your kid to be able to read, write, do arithmetic, we don't even do that job. We're somehow qualified to tell your kid, yeah, this delusion that you have that you're a boy when you're a biological girl, that's real. And we're here to affirm you. We're here to uphold you. And then when your parents find out after a suicide attempt that you have gender dysphoria, which has been concealed from them the entire time by your teachers who have participated in your little delusion, somehow that's the parent's problem. The parent's a bigot. The parent is the reason the kid's committing suicide because they don't participate in the delusion. They tell their kids that their biological sex is the only empirical, valid basis of their gender identity, which it is. I mean, gender is bullshit when it's disconnected from an empirical basis like sex. But, hey, you know, this is the world in which we live. This is what we pay taxes for. We pay taxes for these people to tell us this kind of shit and to stand on this kind of shit and to practice this kind of shit. Like, I am so sick of it. I've had 4 years of it with the Hamlin case over at investigations of ritual abuse. It's stunning to me that man didn't go to prison for what he did. He's on tape apologizing to his daughter, saying, I am sorry for raping you, and they still couldn't convict him. He was found by a court in 2003 to have molested his 2 eldest daughters. Never did a day of time in jail. Never did a day of time in prison for what he did. So by that standard, you know, Officer Colton Johansson, the school resource officer at Ogden High School, who admitted to molesting an infant in 1994 and who admitted to having child sexual abuse material in his garage at his private residence, him getting 30 days, that's actually pretty good for the state of Utah. That's damned harsh. Like, and you see this time and time again, and you say to yourself, at some point, people are going to be fed up enough to get in the streets and insist that something be done about this, and they're not. They're just not. Like, all the things that we've read about, all the things that we've heard about in the Epstein files, there's no reason to disbelieve them. As awful and heinous as they are, what we know about Jeffrey Epstein, what he's discussing in his emails, he sent that shit over Gmail. Okay? Like, he wasn't worried about getting busted. He sent it over his private Gmail account where it would be flagged or screened by Gmail. He did so with impunity. He never worried about any of that. And he did a lot of it after he was convicted of sex crimes against children. He was a registered sex offender. He didn't give a shit. Why should he? Out of 1,000 reports of sexual assault in this country, or 1,000 instances of sexual assault in this country, 310 of them are going to result in a report. I'm surprised it's that much, because victims see this stuff with Colton Johansson. They see this stuff with Mike Moon and Jamie Peterson and all the other people that we've presented in here. Why would they come forward and report it all? Why would they bother? Anybody who saw what happened to Emily Sheets and Tobias Schroeder over the past 4 years when they reported David Lee Hamlin for sexual abuse, why would they be in a rush to come forward to the police? Look at everything that we've reported on IRA, everything we've reported on AntiTribe, everything we've reported on government sex predators and church predators, everything that we've outlined here, all the documentation that we've reported to substantiate the allegations against these people. And these people are walking around free. And it's not just them. Like, David Lee Hamlin is nothing. He's a nobody. But if you look at what's going on in the Epstein files, if you look at the people who are involved, and a lack of culpability, the lack of accountability, you say to yourself, when's it going to stop? When is the public going to finally have enough of this and rise up? And what you say to yourself is, they're not. Nothing is going to happen in terms of a mass movement. If anything is done about this, it will be done by a very select minority of people who are fed up. Because the solution is not going to be political to this. The solution is not going to be peaceful. The solution is when parents find out that their children are being molested and raped and groomed by teachers, they're going to take the law into their own hand. We're not going to have a functioning law-abiding society. We're not going to have civil order. We're going to have people who are just fed up with this. They're fed up with the fact that even if they do report, only 28 reports are out of 1,000 are going to result in a conviction, and 25 will result in incarceration. In those 25 cases, the sentences will be laughable. Like Ray Holmberg, the senator from North Carolina that I highlighted earlier, went to Prague 14 times in 10 years to rape boys in child brothels and in the public park that was in front of the main train station in Prague. He got 10 years out of a possible 30-year sentence. He didn't even get a year for each trip that he took to Prague to rape those boys. Like, why would you report if you're a victim? Why, if you're a victim, or if you're the parent of a victim, why would you go to the police? The police don't do shit. The judges don't do shit. I mean, at this point, they don't have any credibility whatsoever. Like, you can literally be on tape apologizing to your kid for raping her. They aren't going to convict you. That's what happened with David Lee Hamlin. That's the central focus of investigations on ritual abuse. Has been for 4 years. And the amount of documentation that I've turned up to corroborate those allegations and everything, they're not doing anything to him. They're not convicting him of a single crime. And the reason is because David Lee Hamlin knows a lot of stuff about a lot of people in Utah. A lot of other people who participated in child sexual abuse. And they dressed it up in satanic mumbo-jumbo, but at the end of the day, they're a bunch of garden variety child rapists and perverts. That's all they are. And they're going to evade culpability because ultimately it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's a bunch of politically and socially connected people who are going to get away with raping kids. And it's not just Utah. It's everywhere. Look at what's happening right now. We are in a war with Iran because our president wanted to take our minds off of the Epstein files. Like, there are people who support our president who said they wouldn't give a shit if he had molested their children. Like, that's where we're at as a country. That's where we're at as a community. That's where we're at morally. I have been talking for the better part of, an hour and a half. I'm going to open it up to any questions that anybody wants to ask. If anybody has any questions for this episode. So type it up in the live chat over there in the right if you do. If not, I'm going to cut this episode right here. And we'll see you guys next week. I appreciate everybody who tuned in, who watched as the episode was being live streamed. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. This is Goel with Investigations and Ritual Abuse and AntiTribe. And this has been AntiTribe, the Freakin' Weekend, episode 104. Child Sex Offender Lite, and the future that doesn't work and the enemies within. We'll see you guys next week because there will never be any shortage of this kind of material for people like me to cover. There will never be any. These people are not going to stop until the day they die, and let's face it, there's no movement afoot in a lot of states to hold these people accountable. As a reminder, I want you to call your elected representatives in Congress and ask them to support Trey's Law, which was brought to the floor or brought as a bill in the Senate by Senators Ted Cruz and Kirsten Gillibrand. Trey's Law would make non-disclosure agreements and child sexual abuse settlements unenforceable. And that means that child sex abuse victims and witnesses can talk openly and without fear of repercussion about what they know in terms of child sexual abuse. And it's a vital tool. A lot of states have already passed some version of it. We need it at the federal level, so call your federal representatives and senators, your congressmen and congresswomen, and let them know that you want them to vote yes on Trey's Law and move that forward from the bill stage to legislation. Let them know that you've had enough. And let them know that victims and witnesses to child sexual abuse should not be silenced by non-disclosure agreements, that wealthy perpetrators of sexual abuse against children should not be able to buy silence with a non-disclosure agreement as part of a civil settlement. I am Goel with AntiTribe and Investigations of Ritual Abuse, Government Sex Predators, Church Predators, and Fringe Concerns, Alien and Sedition Media Warehouse. Thanking you for tuning in,